Welcome to Renaissance Charge Videos. I'm Rick Friedrich. So today I'm going to remind everybody about the Benitez system. What inspired this video was finally getting around to looking at Peter Lindemann's video, which was basically a copy of what I was showing 2 years earlier. And so I want to make a couple of corrections there and just remind everybody what we've shown way back in 2016, I believe, yes. And I want to talk about the upcoming meetings in Europe, where we hope to do some more demonstrations of the Benitez system. And here I'm just going to do, I'm not going to show what I showed in the videos way back because you can look at those and I'll put the links in the description. But I wanted to bring out a couple of points here that I mentioned before, and those videos are so long ago that people might not even realize they're there. So I want to remind everybody we do have a booklet of all the Benitez patents. However, there's an update on this, not in this book yet, but there is a Spanish patent that we were beginning to look into and translate from the 1940s. And anyway, we have this booklet of the other patents, and the other one I have not replicated or finished the translation because I do not speak Spanish, but we were hoping to get more information on Benitez personally through the Mexican archives. But somebody was contacting me about that, and I lost track of them during COVID. They couldn't access all the information, but they were accumulating quite a bit of information. They were interested in this historical project that I started here. So that's that I wanted to cover. So let's look at Peter Lindemann's video and little presentation. So 2 years after I did the series on the first free energy patent was misunderstood, which is relevant to what Peter talks about. Peter comes out with a demonstration at one of the meetings, which those meetings were, by the way, the ones that I started in Coeur d'Alene, and they took over when I left, but that's another story. Anyway, so when I started getting into this in more depth and looked at the Daniel Cook patent, and I was realizing that people were misunderstanding that patent because they didn't understand what an induction coil was at the time. Now Peter Lindemann gets into his video and basically repeats the same stuff that I shared, but without giving me any credit. Of course, he was somewhat of my enemy at the time. Hopefully we're not enemies anymore, and hopefully this video doesn't make us worse enemies, but I have been known to review some of his videos with critique. So anyway, he talks about in that video in 2018 what I had mentioned in this patent, and I did a series of videos, 5 videos, and then there was more Benitez videos later on, like a year later, and so, but my main point was people misunderstood what an induction coil was. Now Peter kind of brings up that point again, and acts like he had recently discovered this fact that they didn't understand the diagram. Well, he was talking about this diagram here in the Benitez patent, which is an induction coil, which is like a transformer, but it has an interrupter, right? And you'll see that here. That's the thing that's making all the noise, right here. So now the thing about patents is, as I mentioned in that video, is that patents are not for the general public. They are for people within the trade, in the know of the art, which they usually refer to in the patent, the art, and so forth. So if you're not familiar with the art, then you will not understand the patterns. Now Benitez was very clarifying, and in various diagrams here, you can see clearly that there's an interrupter on there in the diagram. But then there are other patents. Well, first of all, I want to clarify another thing, that I want to clarify what happened in the video with Lindemann. He's talking about the patents in almost a sequential order. But what he doesn't understand, I guess, from the description or the progression of patents is the order of the first patent. Now, there's only 2 patents altogether here. There's additions to the patent. That's not a major point, and I'm not going to be nitpicky here, but this particular diagram right here was the first one. And I'm calling these, as I've mentioned before, Benitez switch 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, and 8. You can see at the top here. And I've provided all these diagrams online already. But this particular patent, which is where it starts off on, which is represented in this model right here without any capacitors or inductors. This is just a switching mechanism, which we'll talk about. And this is actually capacitors. Well, actually, this is not even this one. I'm sorry. This is the second version right here. So he did not, Peter Lindemann did not show this version at all, which is not a battery system. It's purely capacitors. And so I think he didn't read all these patents very thoroughly through, or even know maybe about the first and second addition to the patent, because this is actually 1914. He only mentioned 1915 in his diagrams. So anyway, he talked about these as being batteries in the video, but actually they were capacitors as well. Mind you, you could make them batteries, but that's not what he said. I mean, he called them accumulators, and of course a bank of capacitors is a battery as well. When you have more than one cell, you've got 2 cells, you have a battery of either capacitors or of these particular cells that we refer to as batteries today. Not terribly big point, but I just want to clarify that. So in this case, when you pay attention to the details in the video, or in the patents, then you'll understand he talks about the improvement from going from capacitors to batteries, and which is the area that Peter Lindemann is talking about. But this particular arrangement is very convenient, especially on a small system, and if you don't want to have the big battery banks. And I think Peter mentioned in his video talking about the Tesla switch, which I found it interesting that he said, made the point, which I think is very important, distinction that Bedini never really made very clear. And that's one thing I give credit to Peter over the years. He's usually been quite clear and specific and not exaggerated his claims. And I'll talk about that in a little bit later on another side of things. So anyway, the point is that he said the Tesla switch is similar to this 4-battery switching system, which is actually the later patents here, the later additions to the patents. So we have 2 batteries in series, and then you would have 2 batteries in parallel. Here I'm just running the one by itself because I'm not going to try and demonstrate this to prove anything out in this video. I'm just trying to make clarifications from the previous video and a review of Peter's video. So So we have two batteries that are switching over an hour interval, which we've been doing with our dual pole and other motors. And we have the whole switching circuit that's automatic, and we use the latching contactor. That's a 4-pole switch, and we can do this with a 6-pole switch. We do have them, we don't sell them. They're kind of a rare find, so I haven't made them available because I don't know if I continually find those available, so I haven't been selling them. But the idea is that we switch the batteries around every hour from series parallel to series parallel in the opposite way. So one battery is charging, the other one's discharging, and rotate them around. So similar to what we're doing with the motor systems, what we call the stage 2 process. So instead of our motor being in the series with the induction coil, or sorry, in series with the transformer and the batteries, we have an induction coil here, or the motor in the what I call stage 2 process. So what he mentions about that, just briefly stating that the Tesla switch is not actually discharging or charging up the other batteries, which is very significant. It's rotating them back and forth at a high frequency. Now, the question is, what is that frequency? And with a lead acid battery, especially, it is not wanting to go, you don't want to do that with a low frequency. You can do that every hour, rotate the batteries where they're in charge mode and in load mode. That's the way the battery wants to be. It doesn't want to flip-flop back and forth. Now, other batteries can handle that more, like a lithium battery can actually do that more, nickel metal hydride, but there are certain frequencies that are not good for a battery, for certain battery types. That's a long story to get into. But with a lead acid battery, if you're going to push current, if you're ever pushing current in a way that's moving the plates one direction, which is, say, in a loading mode, you're pushing the plates one direction, and then in the charging mode, you're pushing them the opposite direction. The batteries are meant to go from a rest, like we'll call that the center, to load, and back to rest, without being going from load past rest to charge. And that's what the Tesla switch is doing. And hundreds, if not thousands of people were misled by Bedini in that, which he knew that to be a problem and didn't stress it enough to clarify it. And a lot of people, well, lost faith in him, and I was disappointed too, but I did pick up on the details. And you could say it's people's fault, they didn't listen or whatever. Sure, but it wasn't clarified when it could have been. And at least Peter said something there. I mean, he didn't stress it, he didn't make a big point out of it. I've done that in several videos now over the years, because I experienced the problem of damaging batteries doing that way. That's why the first premise of my company, Renaissance Charge, is battery longevity, or biological longevity too. So what I'm getting at is, he did stress that the Tesla switch is, which is not really Tesla switch, but whatever, it's been called that by Brandt and then Bedini, that is really a potential switch that is creating kind of a virtual potential in which you're not really discharging the battery. And there's special or certain characteristics about that. And the Newman motor is a very similar concept, where when you have a high inductance, and you are switching rapidly enough and short enough on time that you will not discharge the battery, and you'll still create this big magnetic field, which then can do work for you. So on the Tesla switch, that's not clarified at all, that point, or part of it necessarily. It's, people aren't really taught the details of what to do with that kind of unit. But that system will, if you switch it short enough on time and fast enough, then your batteries won't discharge. And so that's different than this system. This system is similar in another context, which will do the same thing. It will be running the one battery to power the motor and the load and charge the other battery bank, and then switch over every hour, not rapidly. So you have real current movement, except when we talk about what they're going to talk about here. We can eliminate the current altogether. We'll talk about that later. But in this system, without getting into the high voltage side, which we'll talk about it in a minute, when we run this, what happens is in the induction coil between the primary and secondary, and in the oscillation that's taking place because of the interrupter, you're going to have a gain system. Now, however your theory is, it doesn't matter to me so much what you believe, as long as you see the results, right, and they're safe results. And oh, by the way, we are going to attempt to demonstrate the fuller circuit here. Where is it? Well, here's one that's kind of marked up a bit, where we have two induction coils. One is with an actual spark gap, so it doesn't have the interrupter on it, but it functions the same way as the interrupter, which is what Benitez says in the patents. So we're going to try and demonstrate this. We have that already in Europe, and it's getting set up to be presented in the 3 meetings, where we actually have this thing running in a self-running form. So I'm going to explain an even easier system here in a minute. But what I wanted to get at is, before I finish that thought out, I'm kind of jumping around here, I apologize, but going back to Cook's patent, which is 40 years earlier than this patent. It's in the early 70s, 1870s now. And this is in 1914, 1918 context. So this is coming from, no doubt, Cook's patent, and it's all the Tesla shuffling of energy circuits. It's not really coming from Benitez. Sure, the battery and the claim that he made about batteries is, but really it's in the context of Tesla shuttle circuits, as Barrett said 100 years later, Terence Barrett, as I've talked about. So what you have here is, again, without the interrupter, going back to Cook's patent, you wouldn't have anything going on here. You have to have some kind of pulsing system in order to not have just a dead short. Now there is some ways around that I'm not going to get into, but that's not what Cook was doing. So Cook had basically the equivalent of what you see right here, and the 2 induction coils, or one with an interrupter and one with a spark gap. But he did not have to show that part. And as mentioned in the video, what is that now, 8 years ago, almost, 7, 8 years ago, when I did the first free energy patent was misunderstood, I showed how the induction coil for about 100 years, and that was right in the middle of that 100 years, was always having, you use the word induction coil, you always had an interrupter on it. Because you have the word transformer distinguishing from the induction coil, which was having the interrupter on it. Now, obviously the induction coil was usually a transformer, but I've had one of the biggest ones you ever found, that was about this big, 80 pounds, that only had a primary coil, just one coil. There was no secondary on it. So that would be specifically an induction coil, not a transformer. But what I'm saying is, that point I stressed, and I had so many people all around the world say, oh boy, I feel silly because I was trying to make 2 transformers do something like Cook's patent, and I could never figure it out. I was trying to figure out what the secret was. Well, unless you do some other things, and you would have some special type of things going on, which I can't get into, you would never have that closed circuit ever doing anything. Now, if you get into resonance, you can have an oscillation energy, but that's a little tricky to try and do with an iron core transformer concept. So I wanted to make some clarifications again. One, that I found it interesting that Peter says he didn't realize that there was an interrupter on there. I think it was this diagram he was referring to. And I mean, you can see the knob on there. That's not anything but a interrupter on there. It's pretty obvious. So, but what I wanted to mention further, and I had mentioned this in the first video on the subject, was Benitez clarifies, because in this particular patent right here, you can see in this image right here, so this is the 17811, the 1940, the very first edition. So on this diagram right here, that and then this one over here, these are both induction coils. He specifies in there, he says otherwise called a converter. So there's another word for induction coil, a converter. But he says the interrupter is not shown in the diagram. He specifies that it is there, but he doesn't need to show it because this is for people who are following the details of what they're reading, and that they are understanding the art and what the words are used for and how they're used in context. So the fact is that people didn't understand that. They think of an induction coil today as being a single or a double coil, like a transformer, or just a coil of wire with or without a core, an air core or solid core. So it's important to know history. But I brought it out 2 years before. Of course, I knew earlier than that, but I did the series later on. And I'm not saying that Peter didn't understand Benitez, because he drew attention to that years ago, to the patents of Benitez. But I said that when I first did those videos, why isn't anybody focused on this? And so obviously people were starting to pick up interest after I did those videos, and 2 years later Peter finally gets around to it, which I was glad to see. I congratulate on him for him showing something. He didn't show it doing anything practical, which was unfortunate, which he's fully capable of doing. And I want to bring up that in a minute, about another detail about that. But it looks like from the way he did the video that he found out from my video about the interrupter. It should have been that he talked about Cook's patent though, and that's where the biggest misunderstanding is, because no one reads these patents and fails to see the interrupter because it's specifically mentioned in the patent. So it's not like you could miss that unless you were just glossing over it, which I think what I see from Peter is that what he was doing actually, because of several things he was saying and missing. So what I find, a couple of things I want to mention here is, beyond the fact that it's very much a rehashing of what I said, there isn't anything in his video that it's not mentioned in mine, and that's fine. It's just, I mean, obviously we had parting of ways, and he's not going to give me any credit for anything, but I will give him credit for things, and I'll talk about that maybe in a minute. So even though we're at odds with each other, I'll still give people credit. But I will talk about friends or foe in the same way in clarification of things, right? So this is not about any kind of trying to make somebody look bad. I'm trying to do that. So so one of the things I think that is quite wrong in what he was saying, and it shows that he has not worked with the system to understand it really, and it makes me wonder again exactly what he understands about the SSG circuit and the Bedini system as well. He said that specifically the lawn and garden batteries that he had there could not sustain this Benitez system right here in itself, could not sustain itself with a regular induction coil and those batteries, which are lawn and garden batteries. We use them all the time in the shop, and Peter came around the shop often enough to see we were using these all the time, and he used them, and he said those are about 13 amp hour batteries, if you want to think in terms of amp hours. These are about 14 amp hours. These are. So these are the same as your lawn and garden batteries that he had there. He said that they could not sustain with this system more than 1.8 COP, and so they could not sustain the whole system in operation. He said you would need a bigger battery bank. So Peter does not understand the way the Benitez system works, and I understand he's focusing on what we call negative energy or cold energy, and whatever terms he uses now. It doesn't matter. It doesn't matter what terms they use. But he was thinking in terms of the greater the size of the collector, the more energy you can get into the system from the environment, or for however you want to describe it. And I understand that concept. I teach on that. However, I can use very small batteries here and see them rotated around and sustain a charge with, and I've got at least 20 of these induction coils with interrupters, different sizes of it, really big ones, small ones, and the batteries sizes don't have anything to do with it. So that I want to be clarified. You don't need bigger batteries to make this work. And it's actually a plug-and-play system. Obviously the interrupter is not convenient. It goes out of tune, you can't run it for very long. Oh, and one point that I would like to make is most of these are for 6 volts, some of them are even 4 volts. This one's only 10 volts. I've been running it at 12 volts and damaging it. This at 10 volts DC input gives you 80 kilowatts, or kilovolts I should say. And on the secondary here you'll have some big streamers. So when I'm running at 12, we're probably about 100,000 volts here. And so we're going to talk about this in a minute. So the problem with Peter's demonstration was his motor. His motor is not able to do the same thing as the schoolgirl motor would do. If you replace that with the actual schoolgirl motor, or the SG motor as we talked about, in fact, as we're going to make in this new model right here, which is basically the same as the old model. I don't have the coils in there at all, but if he was to use those with a bigger inductor in it that is not got the kind of core he was using with his reluctance motor, then he would get more of a charge into the batteries. So I'm really surprised that he said that, considering he has the 3 books on the SG circuit and talked about it in the video. So the problem isn't in the size of the batteries, the problem was in his motor demonstration. It wasn't producing anything significant in the pulsing in order to make that work beneficially. So, I mean, is that a wash? Is that a bad presentation to say, to present something like that and show that it's not working? It doesn't have a model that even works. To sustain itself, I don't think it would be worthy of doing a video on it unless you had it personally working, and then if you did have it working, you'd show it in a video. I'm not trying to prove anything in this video because I've already shown for a long time period, and I don't try and prove something in a video, but if I'm going to make a promotion of something, I'm definitely going to have to experience that before I promote it, and that's my point there. So I don't think he understands the process of the charging in the Benitez system, and I'm not sure exactly how much he really understands, although of the SG system, even though there's a lot of good information in there in his booklets. I'll be going over them more in the future and looking at them more carefully. But so we talked about most of these things now. And I want to say, I was just looking over one of his videos with John Bedini and Tom Bearden from 1984, and they put that video out a couple of years ago. I think it was from Psychotronics initially, because I remember Jeffrey Miller told me about it and showed me that video before Aaron put it out. So what happened was, in that video, there's some interesting comments. I'll just go off topic here a little bit, where John Bedini actually says if you drop some gold into the battery, the plates might turn into gold. It was rather funny. Transmutation, he was saying, was taking place in there. But the thing I want to bring up was, John said there was a 9-to-1 gain in the system of the one motor that Peter had shown him. And then when Peter was pressed by another person in the meeting asking him specifically what was the COP, he didn't want to, he kind of diverted from the question until he was pressed to answer it, And then he truthfully came out and said it wasn't a COP over 1. And so that's where I have found Peter, when he publicly speaks, he usually is telling you what he really believes. Now, maybe I'm wrong, but I found it a lot more accurate than John. And I mean, I know the two enough to know they both felt about how they felt about each other. And yeah, I think that Peter was quite aware of John's exaggerations of things. But anyway, I wanted to make that point here that, you know, Peter has spoken about his own experience in a way that hasn't been overly exaggerative that I've seen. Now, he doesn't really come out and say very much. He seems to almost be more of a skeptic at times. But then he did say the SSG motor could do over 2 or 3 times the output in this very video that I'm talking about. So I was glad to hear at least that, although as I've shown and talked about, we can make those things run an infinite output. We can put what we call the 3rd stage process as an addition to that and make that a prime mover. So it's not really the SSG motor anymore, it's an addition to that. But there are all sorts of things that can be done. Peter was aware of that. But he did give a fair representation, I think, of the outcomes that people can usually have for that system. So now the purpose of this video more or less is I want to make one point. So I will be having a couple of induction coils. I haven't had access to them yet because I'm not yet in Europe, and we will have some induction coils that are high voltage. And so the point that I was going to make here, which I didn't make over the years in passing, but I wanted to make a special note of it in this video, that when we run, so let's, first of all, we'll run this one before we hook up to this one here. So, all right, this is not tuned, it's not all right. We've already seen this sort of thing. This one's a real neat one. Before I get into this one, I wanted to just show that before I just connect it all and hook it up onto this one here. So this one has this variable resistor here. It's a stone, which is nice. And I'm not hooking up the secondary at all. You can see I'm just running it through one of our transformers that we have for our battery charger. And this is not in resonance or anything. We're not doing even the more ideal pattern or version right here. We're not adding the capacitor or anything. So this is just kind of a reminder of what we've done. So what I'm going to do now is show you or just talk about this one, essentially. So what I found is, okay, say I hook it up in the same way. We have two, this is what I did with this years ago. After I did all my demonstrations and all that, I got this one, which you can't find anywhere worldwide. They don't make this anymore, unfortunately. So when I put this, okay, when I ran this smaller inductor, lower voltage, with these batteries and other batteries, one would charge up one bank, the parallel bank, and then the series bank would discharge, and then I would rotate them around, right? And so I was able to almost every time sustain the battery rotation unless I didn't have something tuned right, too much arcing in the interrupter or whatever, while having a load, just like we do with the motors, right? Then when I added this one instead of this one, now I'm not going to show any load or anything here, I'm just going to show it running. See, this thing is hurting. But anyway, when I was running this, in place of this, this is 100,000 volts at 24 volts input. So there's a lot going on in there. And so when I ran this, what I found was, not just, it's really, you cannot, under these high voltages here, you cannot use a voltmeter on it without ruining these voltmeters. So you have to wait and periodically check it when it's turned off. But anyway, when I checked it, even after 24 hours of rest, the input battery had charged up faster than the charging battery bank. And so it was during that time that I was starting to wonder, this is a significant point here now, in the Don Smith system, was it really the quarter wavelength or a wavelength phenomena of the input wires from the battery to the little neon sign transformers? Was it that length of wire picking up a wavelength from the system that was charging the battery or keeping the battery from discharging? And that's what he said, and it may have been some of the cases, but when I've done these systems of Don Smith, as well as here, when I did it here and realized I wasn't dealing with a quarter wavelength or whatever wavelength of these wires, it was creating a plasma phenomena here. And this battery was in that field, and the wires and all that, and it was just basically keeping itself charged, however you want to describe that. I don't need to get technical here. So I wanted to mention that, as like Don said, there was a half dozen ways of keeping that input battery charged. Now, mind you, many of the times he was running like 1 watt to the most maybe 20 watts as his input from the battery, and running kilowatts output, which is all very easy, and it's not that big of a deal if you have to keep a battery receiving some charge from an inverter or whatever, if you had to, when it's only that kind of small wattage. But in fact, the batteries didn't discharge. So in this particular, with this very particular model here, and I believe you want to get up at least past 20,000 volts. And then again, that's kind of a relative statement to what size of induction coil you have. If you have it tuned, like if you have it actually in resonance, like when you have the capacitors here, and in this circuit here diagram, we have a capacitor and it's in series with the terminal or the interrupter, and the difference between this pattern diagram and a regular ignition coil and induction coil is the capacitor is across the terminals. And it, as Benitez actually pointed out, is the secondary application to protect the spark gap. It is not the primary. Now, everybody would tell you when I ask that question to thousands of people, they don't know of any other purpose for that capacitor. But that capacitor is, you can have that as a tank circuit, right? In the early days, they were doing stuff like that, and it was in the art to know that, right? But what Benitez pointed out is you don't have to be on both of the sides of the terminals to actually have it protected and perform the other main function, because you could have a series or a parallel tank circuit. But anyway, in this case, what we're finding is this capacitor gets charged and then it dumps into the battery bank every cycle. So there's oscillations between the primary and the secondary. They're influencing each other back and forth. And I showed that, I just looked at it the other day, the old video, and halfway through the video, I think it was the last video on Benitez system, I show the waveform, and you can see about 30 oscillations each cycle, each on time or off time, and it's opened up, it's ringing. And so that's going to charge batteries. So again, those factors, when we're dealing with resonance, that's not about battery size at all. So that's the point I want to make. So I want to stress that. I'm not going to be able to bring this with me. I've been debating about it. I don't really want to put it in my suitcase, nor do I want to ship it all the way over there. It's pretty heavy. And so I thought, all right, I can't bring it. I'm not sure how the other one will turn out when I bring it, but I wanted to mention that because that's going to be one of the points that I bring up in the video or the meetings. And hopefully we can have some more demonstrations along that line. Now we're going to hopefully get the Corona motor. We have one here that I'm not going to demonstrate it because it isn't mine. But this particular one was made some years ago, and the battery that was running that stays charged. Now that's really high voltage as well. So that's another thing that was very similar to this and to all these systems. That so when you realize that, then it's very easily to make a self-runner. You don't even have to have the thing producing like kilowatts of power output to have something demonstrated. That's why I've been scratching my head, literally wondering why people haven't dived into the Benitez system. If they're trying to even just prove free energy out and have an experience, they can easily do that with the motors, for one, but even easier with an induction coil, you can see this. Now, I'm not saying that any and every frequency is good for a battery, and that's another whole thing. But you could even use a filter if you're worried about a particular frequency going into the battery. You could put a filter on it if you wanted to. But yeah, it's quite straightforward. It's been a mystery, and to me it's a total cover-up. Like when you look at people that criticize free energy and they single out certain individuals or certain things, it's because they're popular, but there's never been a critique against Benitez. And his patent is so forthright in saying multiple times, clarifying that if you just put these batteries in, the series parallel arrangement without the beneficial process of the interrupter or the induction coil, you would not be able to get a gain. The batteries would discharge. Now, some people misunderstood me when I talked about the second stage process, that all you had to do was put batteries in a series parallel configuration and put a load in between, and presto, you've got a gain. I've had several people telling everybody about that, but not paying attention to the details. I never said that. You would have to have some kind of mechanism to have an open circuit. You have to have an open circuit, and merely creating, and I guess it was Bedini that promoted that whole concept where you have one battery charging up without any pulsing with two two were charged and one was discharged, and kept rotating them around, and eventually they got all charged up. That's never what I was talking about. I was always talking about a pulse in there, and obviously you have to make that a proper kind of pulse as well. So yeah, so once you understand the basics of that, this is all in the family of what Terence Barrett called the Tesla shuttle circuits. In the 1980s, he started bringing that concept out, which actually went into his patents on the ultra-wideband patents that he's responsible for. And so that whole teaching is all the same thing here. It's shuttling the energy around, but in a more or less lack of current and lack of losses in the system, in a true open sense. So that's where we have this, what he called the many bodies, as opposed to the single body monolithic circuit. He said a closed loop circuit that's all in phase with itself is a single body, and very rarely can you get any kind of over unity in that scenario. I say rarely. That's not entirely impossible. But you have a many body concept almost every time, where you have to have what we call an open circuit. Even though it's still electrically connected in loops, they are out of phase with each other, and so you have an open to the environment, some kind of amplification system. So this is something that I've never really seen anybody but Barrett specifically and clearly, without ambiguity, teach. And that's why I started the whole selfish circuits, loving path analogy, bringing that point out very specifically. So we have to ask why these people that were supposedly these leaders and teachers didn't make that very clear. And instead, you had this more or less, especially with Bearden, this really convoluted teaching that you had to have a graduate degree to understand, like supposedly quantum physics, which is, to me, nonsense. Why not just break it down and talk about, like Barrett did break it down, and that's why I pointed those things out. But still, that needed to be made clear. So I'm trying to make things clear. I'm not at war with people. I will expose people if they're really bad players, as I've done with Bedini and others. But my point in this video wasn't to try and bad name Peter. It's merely about clarifying certain things that were misunderstood, and that since I'm the one that really brought it up first, I needed to clarify that in that context. And I just got around to watching that literally moments before I made this video. So I hope that helps, and I want to do this for people that are coming to the meeting, that they want to start preparing for learning about these kinds of systems. We'll go over them in more detail. And that's all I have to say for tonight. Thank you for watching.